The weekend began without tension, without urgency, without anything that would later feel like a warning sign. On Friday afternoon in late summer of 2011, the valley was doing what it always did, sitting quietly beneath a pale sky, waiting for people who believed they understood it. Two experienced hikers arrived just after midday. They had known each other for years, bonded through work, family gatherings, and a shared habit of disappearing into nature whenever life felt too crowded. This trip wasn't ambitious. It wasn't extreme. It was familiar. They parked their vehicle in the designated gravel lot near the trailhead, a place used by day hikers and occasional weekend campers. The area was officially mapped, maintained by local forestry services, and rated as safe for intermediate-level hikers. There were warning boards about weather changes and terrain awareness, but nothing unusual. No closures, no alerts, no sense that the valley was anything other than predictable. Before stepping onto the trail, one of them took a photo. It was casual, unposed, just boots at the edge of the dirt path, trees framing the background. That image would later be studied far more closely than it ever deserved to be. At the time, it was sent to a family group chat with a short message, something light, almost dismissive. A way of saying, "We're here, we're fine, we'll be back soon." Both men had stable lives, jobs that required responsibility, families who relied on them, no recent stressors, no financial trouble, no emotional breakdowns. They had planned this hike weeks in advance, cleared it with their families, and set a return time for Sunday evening. There was no secrecy, no sudden change in routine. They weren't running from anything. They were just leaving town for a couple of days. By early evening on Friday, they had reached the first section of the valley trail. Cell service dropped in and out, as expected. A short voice note was sent to one of their siblings, wind in the background, laughter cutting through it. They talked about setting up camp before dark and starting early the next morning to reach a higher ridge that offered a view of the valley floor. It was ordinary, unremarkable, the kind of moment no one thinks to hold on to. Saturday passed quietly, at least as far as anyone at home could tell. No messages came through, but that wasn't unusual. Reception in the valley was unreliable, and both hikers had been there before. Families assumed they were moving deeper into the trail system, enjoying the break, disconnected by choice rather than circumstance. No one panicked. No one imagined what was coming. By Saturday evening, one family member sent a short check-in text. It didn't deliver. Another message followed. Still nothing. A few hours later, someone joked that they were probably enjoying the silence too much to care about their phones. The assumption was comforting. It made sense. It fit the story everyone wanted to believe. Sunday morning came, and still there was no contact. The planned return time crept closer. Bags were mentally unpacked at home. Meals were expected. Kids asked when they'd be back. By early afternoon, the silence felt heavier. Not alarming yet, but noticeable. Phones were checked repeatedly, as if signal bars might appear through effort alone. By Sunday evening, the concern shifted. This wasn't about poor reception anymore. This was about routine being broken. The vehicle should have been back in the driveway. Phones should have powered on as soon as they reached lower ground. But nothing changed. No calls, no texts, no movement on bank cards, no social media activity, just absence. A family member drove to the trailhead that night. The gravel lot was nearly empty, and there it was, their vehicle, exactly where they had left it on Friday. Doors locked, no sign of disturbance, no note, no indication that anything had gone wrong or that plans had changed. It was as if time had stopped around it. The realization came slowly, painfully. This wasn't a late return. This wasn't a dead phone battery. This wasn't a missed turn that would be laughed about later. This was something else, something that didn't have an easy explanation. Authorities were contacted just before midnight. The initial response was cautious but attentive. Missing hikers weren't uncommon, but most cases resolved quickly. Injuries, exhaustion, weather delays. Still, the timeline mattered. 2 experienced hikers. No contact for over 48 hours. Vehicle left behind. No checkout notification. It was enough to warrant concern. By early Monday morning, local law enforcement arrived at the trailhead. They photographed the vehicle, checked license plates, logged personal items left inside. Nothing seemed out of place. Wallets weren't found in the car. Phones weren't there either. That suggested they had gone onto the trail as planned. The question was simple. but terrifying in its implications. Why hadn't they come back? Search and rescue protocols began forming almost immediately. Maps were pulled, trail routes were reviewed, rangers familiar with the area were consulted. Weather reports from the weekend showed mild conditions. No storms, no extreme temperatures, nothing that should have trapped or overwhelmed two hikers with their level of experience. As daylight spread across the valley, the trailhead filled with quiet urgency. Family members arrived, standing close to the path, staring into the trees as if answers might step out on their own. Volunteers gathered, dogs were brought in. Everyone worked under the same assumption, that the men were alive, somewhere out there, waiting to be found. But even in those first hours, unease crept in. There were no signs of deviation near the trail entrance, no dropped gear, no scuff marks suggesting a struggle or fall. The path ahead looked untouched, clean, indifferent. The last confirmed evidence of their presence remained. That photo from Friday afternoon, 2 pairs of boots, a dirt trail, trees that hadn't moved since, and somewhere beyond that frame, a valley that was no longer just a place for rest and escape. It had become something else entirely. By the end of that first day, one truth settled heavily over everyone involved. Whatever had happened didn't fit the pattern of a simple delay. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a missed signal. 2 people had entered the valley, and 4 years earlier than anyone could imagine, the valley had decided not to give them back. By Monday morning, the valley was no longer quiet. What had been an empty stretch of mapped wilderness became a focal point of controlled urgency. Local law enforcement established a command post near the trailhead, setting up folding tables with maps weighed down by rocks. Radios crackled constantly. Names were written, erased, written again. This was no longer a weekend hike gone late. It was now a missing persons case, and time mattered. Search and rescue teams were activated according to standard protocol for lost hikers. The first assumption was simple and hopeful. The men were injured, disoriented, or delayed somewhere along the trail system. Given their experience level, investigators believed they would likely stay put if something went wrong. That belief shaped everything that followed. Initial trail sweeps began within hours. Rangers and volunteers moved in lines, spaced carefully, scanning the ground for disturbed soil, broken branches, anything that suggested recent passage. Canine units were brought in, trained to track scent from personal items retrieved from family members. The dogs worked methodically, noses low, handlers watching for even the slightest change in behavior. The first find came before noon. A single boot print, partially pressed into damp soil just off the main trail. It matched the general size and tread of one hiker's footwear. People gathered around it quietly, careful not to disturb it further. Photographs were taken, measurements logged. For a moment, optimism flickered. It meant they had been here. It meant the trail was correct. But the print didn't lead anywhere. 10 feet farther, the ground hardened. No follow-up impressions, no scuff marks, nothing that could be followed or connected. It was a point in isolation, not a path. Later that afternoon, a snack wrapper was found near a cluster of trees. The brand matched something one of the hikers was known to carry. Again, hope surged. Again, it faded just as quickly. The wrapper showed no clear timeline. It could have been dropped hours earlier, days earlier, by someone else entirely. There was no way to know. Helicopters began flyovers that same day, tracing the valley from above. The pilots moved slowly, eyes trained on the ground below, looking for unnatural shapes or color breaks that didn't belong. The valley resisted them. Dense tree cover swallowed visibility. Shadows pooled in places that cameras couldn't penetrate. The terrain folded in on itself, creating blind spots that even experienced pilots couldn't see into. As the hours passed, the lack of evidence became its own presence. There were no signs of a fall, no disturbed rock faces, no blood, no damaged gear, no emergency calls logged from their phones. Nothing suggested panic or struggle. It was as if the men had simply stepped off the map. By the second day, search grids expanded. Teams pushed deeper into side trails and less traveled routes. The assumption shifted slightly. Maybe they had taken a wrong turn. Maybe curiosity led them off the main path toward a ridge or overlook. Given their experience, this wasn't impossible. It wasn't reckless. It was human. Weather, which had been mild over the weekend, began to turn. Fog rolled in during the mornings, thick enough to reduce visibility to a few yards in some sections. Light rain followed, soft at first, then steady. Conditions grew colder at night. Each passing hour made survival less likely, and everyone involved understood that, even if no one said it out loud. Families waited at the edge of the search zone, clinging to updates. Every radio transmission caused heads to turn. Every returning team brought a mix of anticipation and dread. When nothing came back, silence settled again. By day 4, exhaustion set in. Volunteers rotated out. Professionals stayed longer, but even they showed signs of strain. Feet blistered. Voices grew hoarse from calling names into empty spaces. Dogs began losing scent entirely, their trails breaking off at random points with no clear explanation. Investigators started to confront contradictions they couldn't reconcile. 2 capable hikers, good weather at the start, clear trails, no evidence of injury, no sign of foul play, and yet no sign of life. The valley itself became an obstacle. Steep drop-offs hid behind brush. Ravines cut sharply into the landscape, invisible until you were nearly on top of them. Tree cover grew so thick in places that daylight barely reached the forest floor. Searchers described the unsettling feeling of areas that swallowed sound, where even shouted names seemed to vanish immediately. By the end of the first week, the tone changed. Briefings grew shorter. Language became more careful. Phrases like recovery effort began appearing quietly in reports. No one wanted to be the first to say what everyone was thinking, that the chances of finding them alive were slipping away. Still, the search continued. Helicopters flew again after weather cleared. Rope teams were deployed to check steep inclines. Waterways were examined for signs of crossing or accidental falls. Nothing emerged, no clothing, no equipment, no remains. As days turned into weeks, resources became harder to justify. The area had been covered multiple times, trails overlapped, grids were rewalked. Each search yielded the same result: nothing. The absence of evidence began to feel deliberate, almost intentional, though no one could explain why. Families struggled with the shifting reality. Hope didn't disappear all at once. It fractured. Some held on to the belief that the men had survived and would emerge eventually. Others began preparing for a different outcome, one that had no shape yet, but felt closer every day. After 2 weeks, the decision was made. The official search would be suspended. It wasn't an end, investigators stressed. Leads would still be followed. Tips would still be reviewed. But the active, large-scale effort was over. The announcement landed heavily. There was no closure, no explanation, no moment that made sense of the silence. Just a valley that had been searched and searched again, and 2 people who were still missing inside it. As teams packed up equipment and maps were folded away, one question remained unanswered, hanging in the air where voices had once called out names. How could 2 people disappear so completely without leaving behind anything that explained where they went? Or why no one could find them? After the search was suspended, the valley grew quiet again. Not the natural quiet it had known before, but a heavier kind, one shaped by unanswered questions. The command post was dismantled. Vehicles stopped arriving. Radios went silent. For the families, this silence was not relief. It was abandonment by time itself. Days passed where nothing happened, then weeks where the absence of updates felt louder than any siren ever could. At first, media attention lingered. Local news outlets ran follow-ups. Headlines repeated the same facts with different wording. 2 experienced hikers vanished during a weekend trip. Search suspended. Anyone with information urged to come forward. But as months slipped by, the story lost its urgency. New tragedies replaced it. The valley stopped making the news, even though it never stopped existing. That vacuum was quickly filled by speculation. Online forums began dissecting the case with obsessive focus. People who had never set foot in the valley pored over maps, satellite images, and weather archives from 2011. Some believed the answer was simple and brutal: an animal attack, sudden and violent, hidden by terrain and time. Others suggested the hikers intentionally went off-grid, discovering a hidden camping route not marked on official maps. A few went further, insisting the men had staged their disappearance entirely, abandoning their lives for reasons no one else could see. Law enforcement monitored these discussions quietly, but none of the theories held up under scrutiny. There were no signs of an animal attack, no blood, no torn clothing, no scattered remains. Predatory incidents rarely erased all evidence, especially involving two adults. The terrain made concealment difficult, not easy. The idea of a secret route was also examined. Rangers interviewed seasoned hikers who knew the valley intimately. Old trail systems were reviewed. Decommissioned paths were mapped again. Nothing led to a place where two people could disappear completely without leaving a trace. Voluntary disappearance was considered and dismissed just as thoroughly. Investigators examined financial records, employment histories, personal relationships. There were no large withdrawals, no secret accounts, no sudden debt, no romantic entanglements that suggested escape. Both men had future plans documented, vacations scheduled, work projects underway, family commitments discussed openly days before the hike. Psychological profiling supported what families had said from the beginning. These were not men looking to disappear. They were future-oriented, grounded, emotionally anchored to their lives. The kind of people who planned ahead, who checked in, who didn't vanish without explanation. Foul play was the most emotionally charged theory, and the one family struggled with the most. Law enforcement approached it carefully. Background checks were conducted. Associates were interviewed. Phones were analyzed for suspicious contact. There was nothing, no threats, no disputes, no reason to believe anyone followed them into the valley or met them there. The trailhead showed no sign of another vehicle staying behind. No witnesses reported unusual behavior. What remained were details that didn't point anywhere, but refused to be ignored. Their credit cards were never used again, not once. No attempted charges, no declined transactions. Their phones never pinged another cell tower after that weekend. There were no partial signals, no brief reconnections. It was as if the devices had been switched off permanently, or destroyed, or carried into a place where networks simply could not reach. Seasonal hikers who continued to pass through the area began sharing their own experiences, often reluctantly. They talked about sudden fog that rolled in without warning, thick enough to erase the trail within minutes. About acoustics that felt wrong, where sound didn't travel the way it should, making it hard to tell direction or distance. Some described moments of disorientation that passed quickly, but left them shaken. Investigators listened, but these accounts offered no concrete explanation. Weather anomalies didn't explain total disappearance. Disorientation didn't erase evidence. The valley might be unpredictable, but it wasn't supernatural. Everything that happened there had to follow physical rules, even if those rules weren't fully understood yet. As the first anniversary passed, families held quiet memorials without bodies. They returned to the trailhead, leaving flowers near the spot where the vehicle had been found. The gravel lot looked the same. Trees hadn't shifted. The path still waited, unchanged. That constancy made the loss harder to accept. Nothing marked the place where everything went wrong. Law enforcement officially reclassified the case as cold. It didn't mean it was closed. It meant there were no active leads to pursue. Files were archived but not forgotten. Periodic reviews were scheduled. Tips were logged, though most were vague or contradictory. Each one raised hope briefly, only to let it fall again. For the families, time fractured. Some days felt normal. Others collapsed under the weight of not knowing. They replayed the last messages over and over, listening for something they might have missed. A hesitation, a tone change, anything that could explain why that weekend ended the way it did. The valley remained open to hikers. People continued to walk the same trails, unaware or only vaguely aware of what had happened there. Life moved forward everywhere, except in the unanswered space the disappearance left behind. By the second year, public interest had nearly vanished. Online theories grew quieter. New cases replaced old ones. But internally, the mystery hardened. Without evidence, without explanation, the disappearance became something that couldn't be resolved by logic alone. Investigators, though officially inactive, still returned to the case from time to time. A map revisited, a report reread, a question asked again in a different way. Each review ended the same way, with nothing new. What unsettled them most was not what they didn't know, but what they did. Two people had entered a mapped, familiar valley. They had not left it, and yet the valley refused to show where they were. As years passed, the case existed in a strange state. Not alive, not dead. Suspended. Waiting for something that no one could name yet. And somewhere within the untouched folds of the valley, Whatever truth had been hidden there remained exactly where it was, unseen, undisturbed, and patient. By 2015, 4 full years had passed since the valley last made headlines. In most places, time had done what it always did. It smoothed the sharp edges of memory. It replaced urgency with routine. New stories took the place of old ones. For the public, the disappearance had faded into the background noise of unresolved cases that never seemed to end. But for the families, time had not moved in the same way. It had stalled, looping back on itself every time they thought they were finally adjusting to the not knowing. Each year, on the same weekend in late summer, they returned to the trailhead. There were no ceremonies, no cameras, no official presence. Just quiet visits, flowers placed where the gravel met the dirt, hands resting on the wooden trail sign that still listed distances and elevation changes, unchanged since 2011. They walked a short distance down the path, never far enough to feel like they were intruding on the place where answers might still be hiding. The valley offered them nothing new. It never did. Officially, the case remained open, but inactive. It lived in filing cabinets and digital archives, reviewed occasionally when a tip came in or when a new investigator asked to understand it. Each review ended the same way. No evidence of crime, no indication of survival, no remains, no explanation that fit all the facts without breaking something else in the process. Meanwhile, the valley itself underwent changes that had nothing to do with the disappearance. Environmental assessments were conducted as part of a broader conservation effort. Erosion patterns were shifting. Tree growth had altered drainage in some areas. Certain sections of trail needed re-evaluation before being fully reopened to the public. These were practical concerns, handled by departments that rarely intersected with missing persons investigations. By mid-2015, the decision was made to reopen the valley for limited recreational use. Portions of the trail system remained restricted, but enough had been cleared and assessed to allow controlled access. The announcement was brief. It did not mention the hikers by name. It did not reopen old questions. It was framed as routine land management. As part of that process, a private environmental survey team was contracted to document erosion and terrain changes. Their task was technical and specific. They were there to gather data, not to search for people. High-resolution drones had become a practical tool by then, used to reach areas that were dangerous or impractical for ground crews. This was standard practice. It had nothing to do with the case, at least not officially. Still, the paperwork crossed desks that remembered the disappearance. Investigators were notified of the planned drone flights, mostly as a courtesy. The consultation was brief and procedural. Flight paths were reviewed to ensure they didn't interfere with restricted zones tied to the original search. No additional requests were made. No one suggested altering the plan to look for evidence. 4 years had taught everyone the same lesson. The valley did not give up its secrets easily. Privately, expectations were low. If anything had been visible from above, helicopters would have seen it in 2011. If anything had survived weather and time, search teams would have found traces during those first weeks. The drones were there to document land movement, not to rewrite history. The contrast was difficult to ignore. Life outside the valley had continued in clear, measurable ways. Children grew older, jobs changed, people moved. Inside the valley, everything felt suspended. Trails looked the same. Trees stood where they always had. The absence remained, as complete as it had been on the first day the search ended. For the families, the reopening stirred conflicting emotions. Part of them welcomed the idea that people would walk those paths again, that the place would not remain frozen in loss. Another part recoiled at the thought. The valley had been the last place their loved ones were known to exist. Opening it felt like reopening a wound that had never healed. They were informed about the survey work in advance, not because permission was required, but out of respect. The notification was careful, neutral, and devoid of expectation. It mentioned drones. It mentioned mapping. It did not suggest discovery. In the days leading up to the survey, the valley felt unusually still. Rangers prepared access points. The survey team checked equipment, batteries, calibration settings. Everything was logged. Everything was methodical. There was no emotional language in their reports. This was a job, not a vigil. On the morning of the first flight, the weather was calm. No fog, no wind strong enough to interfere with stability. Conditions that survey teams hoped for and search teams had prayed for years earlier. The irony was not lost on anyone who remembered. The team arrived early, unloading cases and equipment near the same trailhead, where the hiker's vehicle had once sat untouched. There was no marker there now, no sign to indicate what had happened. To an outsider, it was just another access point to another stretch of wilderness. Investigators were not present. There was no reason for them to be. This was not a search. There was nothing active to investigate. Still, the flight plan had been reviewed one last time. Elevation ranges, coverage zones, battery limits. The valley was divided into sections, each to be mapped slowly, precisely. Families were not invited to watch. Some chose to stay away entirely. Others came quietly, standing at a distance where they wouldn't interfere. They didn't expect anything. Expectation had been worn out years earlier. What remained was habit, and the hope that if something ever did surface, they would be nearby when it happened. The first drone was assembled and powered on without ceremony. Its presence was oddly small against the scale of the valley. Just another tool doing its job. The operator ran through the checklist aloud, confirming systems were functioning. A final glance at the screen showed a clean signal. There was no announcement, no countdown. The drone lifted smoothly into the air, steady and controlled, rising above the trees that had hidden the valley's secrets for 4 long years. It moved forward on a pre-programmed path, its camera already recording, unaware that it was about to pass over ground that had never truly been searched before. To everyone watching, it looked like just another routine flight. Ordinary, forgettable. And yet, as it disappeared deeper into the valley, one unspoken thought lingered beneath the calm procedures. If the truth was still out there, waiting in silence all this time, this would be the first moment it had a chance to be seen. The discovery didn't happen in the valley, it happened hours later, in a quiet room far from the trees, during what was supposed to be a routine review. By the time the drone completed its programmed flight path, nothing unusual had been reported. The equipment was packed, batteries were logged. The team moved on to other sections, treating the data like any other environmental survey, something to be cataloged, labeled, and stored before deeper analysis. It wasn't until a technician began reviewing the footage frame by frame that something felt wrong. At first, it didn't register as anything specific, just a shape that didn't belong, deep in a side ravine, one that cut sharply away from the main valley floor. There was an angular interruption beneath the canopy. It wasn't organic. It didn't curve or blend like rock or fallen wood. It sat there, partially concealed by branches and shadow, weathered enough to nearly disappear into the terrain, but still unmistakably artificial once the eye adjusted. The technician paused the footage, rewound it, played it again, then slowed it down. What emerged wasn't dramatic, it wasn't obvious, but it was enough to stop the room from feeling ordinary. Beneath overlapping layers of leaves and debris, there was torn synthetic fabric. The color had faded, dulled by years of exposure, but the texture was wrong for the environment. A faint metallic glint caught the light for less than a second. Then the outline became clearer, rectangular, framed, familiar, a backpack. Not the kind carried by day hikers or casual walkers. This was a structured hiking pack, the kind designed for longer trips, the kind both missing men were known to own. The footage was immediately flagged, enhanced, zoomed, stabilized. With each adjustment, the certainty grew heavier. The shape wasn't debris, it wasn't trash, it was gear, and it was exactly where no one had ever searched. Authorities were notified within the hour. The response was swift but controlled. This was no longer an environmental issue, it was a recovery operation. Investigators reviewed the coordinates and understood immediately why the ravine had been missed in 2011. It wasn't visible from above at standard flight altitudes. Dense foliage masked its depth. From the ground, its entrance blended seamlessly into surrounding brush. Even rope teams during the original search had prioritized steeper, more obvious drop-offs. This one hid in plain sight. A specialized recovery unit was assembled, trained for technical terrain. Rope systems were prepared. Safety briefings were conducted with an unspoken gravity that no one needed explained. This wasn't about searching anymore. It was about confirming what everyone already suspected. The descent into the ravine was slow and methodical. Every movement was deliberate. The walls narrowed sharply as the team moved downward, revealing a steep, sudden drop rather than a gradual slope. It was the kind of terrain that offered no warning. One step too far, and there would be no chance to stop. At the bottom, time seemed to behave differently. The air was cooler, still. Debris had accumulated in layers, pressed down by years of rain and seasonal runoff. And there, against the ravine wall, lay what remained of the truth. The backpack was real. So was the second one, a short distance away. Both showed signs of long-term environmental exposure, fabric degraded, zippers corroded, straps fused stiffly into place by moisture and dirt. Nearby, personal items were discovered, small, ordinary things that carried enormous weight. A water bottle, a damaged phone casing, fragments of clothing consistent with what had been worn during the hike. There was no evidence of a struggle, no chaotic scattering. The placement told a quieter, more devastating story, one consistent with a fall that happened quickly, unexpectedly. One person likely went first. The second followed, not in panic, but in instinct, an attempt to help, an attempt that ended the same way. Remains were located further down, partially covered by sediment and organic matter. Forensic examination later confirmed what exposure had already suggested. Time, weather, and terrain had done what they always do. But there were no signs of prolonged survival, no shelter attempts, no fire remains, no markings that suggested they lived beyond the moment they fell. The most critical findings weren't human at all. They were geological. Investigators brought in experts to assess the ravine itself. What they found filled in the last missing piece. Years earlier, after heavy rainfall in the weeks following the hike, the valley had experienced delayed soil liquefaction, a rare but documented phenomenon. Water saturation weakened the ground beneath a thin surface layer, creating what appeared to be stable footing. In reality, it was a concealed collapse zone. When weight was applied, the earth would have given way instantly. The drop wasn't visible from the trail. Foliage covered its edge. To someone walking normally, it would have looked like solid ground. There would have been no warning sound, no time to react, no opportunity to brace or retreat. And once the first person fell, the weakened soil would have continued collapsing, pulling the second person down as well. This explained everything. Why there were no distress calls, why no one heard shouting, why search teams never found evidence along the main trail, why dogs lost scent abruptly, why helicopters saw nothing. The ravine hadn't existed in its final form during the original search. It had deepened, shifted, settled. It had hidden itself until technology finally looked at it from the right angle. Families were notified privately before anything became public. The news arrived with a strange mix of grief and relief. The pain was final now, undeniable. But the uncertainty, the endless loop of what if, was broken. They knew where their loved ones had been. They knew why they hadn't come back. Recovery operations were conducted with care and respect. Items were cataloged, photographed, returned when possible. Investigators documented every detail, not because the case demanded it anymore, but because the story deserved accuracy after years of speculation. When the findings were released, there was no shock in the traditional sense, no villain, no conspiracy, just a sequence of events shaped by timing, terrain, and chance. Two experienced hikers made a reasonable decision on a familiar trail, and the ground beneath them failed without warning. The frame that changed everything wasn't dramatic. It didn't reveal something monstrous or intentional. It revealed how complete a disappearance could be when nature erased its own evidence. As the ravine was marked and the area reclassified as hazardous, one truth settled over everyone involved. The valley had never been empty. It had been holding the answer all along, and now that the truth was finally visible, the only thing left was to understand what it meant to know, after 4 years of silence, exactly where the story had ended. Forensic confirmation arrived weeks after the recovery, not because there was uncertainty, but because time demands process. Bones were examined, fragments were cataloged. What the valley had hidden for 4 years was now reduced to reports, measurements, and conclusions written in careful clinical language. The answers were clear, but they offered no comfort, only clarity. Investigators reconstructed the final moments using terrain analysis, geological reports, and the distribution of personal items. The hikers had not strayed recklessly. They had followed what appeared to be a narrow game trail branching just slightly off the main path. It was the kind of route experienced hikers recognize and trust, subtle, worn, suggesting prior use by animals or other hikers seeking a vantage point. Nothing about it would have raised alarm. The The ground beneath that trail, however, was never what it appeared to be. Heavy rainfall in the days after their hike had altered the valley in ways no one could have predicted at the time. Water seeped into unstable soil layers beneath a thin surface crust, weakening the structure without disturbing its appearance. When the first hiker stepped forward, the earth gave way instantly. There was no slipping, no loss of balance to correct. Just a sudden drop where solid ground had been a moment before. The second hiker followed not out of error, but instinct. Investigators believe he tried to reach the first, moving toward the collapse zone before understanding what had happened. The soil failed again, expanding the break and pulling him down as well. It would have been fast, violent in its physics, but brief. There was no evidence of prolonged suffering, no signs they survived the fall long enough to call for help, no chance to signal distress. That detail mattered more than most people realized. For years, families had imagined every possible scenario. Injuries endured alone, days spent waiting for rescue that never came, decisions made in desperation. The forensic conclusion erased those visions. What happened was immediate, final. The valley did not toy with them. It did not prolong the outcome. It ended it. Law enforcement formally closed the case shortly after the final report was filed. The best language was precise and definitive. Cause of death: accidental fall due to terrain collapse. No evidence of foul play. No contributing human factors beyond environmental conditions. The file that had remained open for 4 years was now complete. Along with the closure came action. Safety advisories were issued nationwide to hiking and forestry agencies. The phenomenon that caused the collapse, delayed soil liquefaction in specific terrain types, was added to risk assessments and training materials. Trails with similar geological profiles were re-examined. Some were rerouted. Others were closed entirely. The valley became a case study, cited not for mystery, but for prevention. The area where the hikers fell was permanently reclassified as hazardous. Warning signs were installed at a distance, careful not to mark the exact location out of respect. Maps were updated, access restricted. The valley was still beautiful, still quiet, still inviting in the way wilderness often is. But now it carried a warning that could not be ignored. Beauty did not mean safety. Familiarity did not mean stability. For the families, the return of remains marked the beginning of something they had not been allowed to do before: grieve fully. Funerals were held months later, once identification was complete and belongings were returned. They were small, private affairs. There were no cameras, no public statements. Just people who had lived in uncertainty for years, finally allowed to mourn without interruption. Eulogies spoke of ordinary things: work ethic, humor, reliability. The way both men showed up when it mattered. The hike was mentioned, but it was not the center of their lives, only the place where those lives ended. The valley was not blamed. Anger faded quickly, replaced by something quieter. Acceptance, shaped by understanding. Knowing how it happened did not erase the loss, but it anchored it. It gave grief a place to stand instead of letting it drift endlessly. Investigators involved in the case reflected privately on what it had taught them. The original search had been thorough by every standard available at the time. No mistakes were identified, no decisions second-guessed. The truth had simply been unreachable then. Technology had changed, terrain had shifted, the answer had waited. That waiting changed how some of them approached future cases. Not every disappearance had a hidden conspiracy. Not every unanswered question meant intent or malice. Sometimes the explanation was buried not by people, but by process, time, and geography. The drone footage that finally revealed the truth was archived alongside the original search records. Together, they told a complete story, one that began with confidence, passed through silence, and ended with understanding. It was not dramatic in the way mysteries often are. It was quieter, more unsettling in its simplicity. The valley did not claim the hikers because they were careless. It claimed them because nature does not negotiate. It does not announce its failures. It collapses when conditions align, indifferent to experience or preparation. When the families returned one final time, they did not walk far. They stood at the trailhead, the same place where everything had last made sense. The gravel lot was fuller now. New hikers arrived, checked maps, adjusted packs. Life continued around them. That too mattered. They did not leave flowers this time. There was no need. The valley no longer held their loved ones. It no longer held the unknown. What it held now was a lesson, paid for at an unbearable cost, but no longer unanswered. The story did not end with mystery. It ended with truth, a truth that was never sinister, never supernatural. Just fragile ground, a moment of trust, and a collapse that erased two lives from view until technology, years later, finally allowed the valley to speak. And when it did, it said only this: people do not always vanish because something is hunting them. Sometimes they vanish because the earth gives way beneath their feet, and the world keeps moving until someone finally looks in the right place.